You know, it's kind of surprising, isn't it? Learning that way before Magellan even showed up. The folks living in the Philippine Islands, they were already part of these really active trade networks.
Absolutely. Trading things like fish for other goods right across the region. It wasn't an isolated place at all.
Okay, let's unpack this. Welcome, everyone, to the Deep Dive, your shortcut to understanding the world.
Glad to be here.
So today, we're taking a journey through the history of the Philippines. We're using insights from, well, a whole collection of historical documents and analyses.
It's a fascinating set of sources.
Our goal here is to pull out the key moments, the big themes that have really shaped the nation, from its earliest beginnings right up to today.
It's a huge sweep of time, obviously.
Right.
Pre-colonial right through to modern times.
Exactly. But the idea is to focus on those major shifts, what caused them, without getting totally bogged down in every single detail. Think of it as the express lane to getting informed.
A way to grasp the core narrative, the essential developments.
And to help us navigate all this, we've got our expert with us.
It's really the deep historical currents that are so compelling here. When you look at the Philippines, it's not just, a local story.
Right.
You're seeing echoes of early global trade, the impact of empires rising and falling right on this part of the world, and just the incredible resilience of the people through all these massive changes. It really wasn't some blank slate just waiting for discovery.
No, definitely not. So let's dive into that pre-colonial Philippines then. Our sources, they talk about early communities built around something called barangays.
Basically kinship groups, families, extended families, led often by a daitu.
And where did they come from? Well, it looks like a lot probably sprang up along the eastern coasts, maybe people heading out for trade or, fishing trips.
Makes sense given the maritime nature of the region.
But there's also evidence for settlements on the western coasts too, maybe drawn by different opportunities. And get this, some theories even suggest early communities popped up on like old volcanic landscapes.
Which is fascinating,
Yeah.
right? It shows how people adapt, how they find resources in all sorts of environments. The barangay system itself, based on family, it gave them structure, social order, when there wasn't a big central state.
Yeah.
And those different origin stories just highlight the diverse geography and, frankly, the ingenuity of the early people living there.
And sticking with social structure for a minute, something that really jumps out is this strong focus on loyalty. Loyalty to a patron.
Yes, that patron-client relationship.
The sources say it was there before the Spanish arrived, but here's the interesting part. Colonial policies, things designed for, collecting taxes and getting labor.
They didn't just ignore the existing system.
No, they actually sort of amplified these hierarchies that were already there. People without land, maybe displaced folks, they became more and more dependent on the local elites.
And that's really the root of that patron-client system we see having such a long-lasting effect. These weren't just abstract connections, they were deeply personal networks.
Affecting everything, right?
Politics, economics, social standing, even getting basic needs met. It really makes you think about how colonial rule sometimes reshaped existing power structures rather than just smashing them.
That's a really key point. It wasn't like a total wipe and replace.
No, often colonialism worked through the existing social fabric, adapting it. By intensifying that patron-client bond, the Spanish, while seeking control and resources, actually ended up strengthening local elites, solidifying power dynamics that, well, we still see echoes of today.
Okay, let's shift to trade. The early economy. Apparently there were some pretty intense debates early on under Spanish rule.
About how to treat native goods, yeah.
Yeah.
Should they be under the same trade rules as Spanish products?
Right. And eventually a royal decree said, yes, natives could sell their goods, but, and this is a big but, they needed the governor's explicit permission.
Always a catch.
And to stop buyers from, fixing prices, sales were limited. Just one day a week in specific areas, often miles away from where the goods were actually made.
Which must have caused huge problems.
Yeah. It had some really weird consequences. Some natives ended up having to pay crazy high prices just to participate, or they just dropped out of trade completely. It even caused some surprising shifts in local markets.
It just shows how hard it is to just impose an external economic system onto one that's already working.
Yeah.
The Spanish wanted regulation, profits.
Sure.
But the rules often backfired,
Yeah.
made life harder for locals. These trade restrictions, the difficulties in collecting taxes effectively, it just highlights the challenge of governing such a spread out island nation with its own established ways of doing things.
So moving ahead now, we hit the Spanish colonization era proper. Magellan's arrival in 1521. That's the date everyone knows.
Symbolic start, maybe.
But it was really Legazpi's expedition in 1565 that locked down Spanish control, naming the islanders after King Philip II.
And in Manila. Conquering Manila, establishing it as the capital in 1571, a hugely strategic move.
Right at the mouth of the Pasig River. And initially, the Philippines was actually run from Mexico under the Viceroy of New Spain. Shows you just how vast that empire was.
Oh, absolutely. And Manila's importance, you can't overstate it. That natural harbor, its position as a gateway to East Asian trade, it was a crucial link in Spain's whole Pacific operation.
A global network.
Exactly. Being tied administratively to New Spain just underlines how the Philippines was plugged into this massive, geographically dispersed colonial system. Trade, governance, everything.
And the changes weren't just political or economic. The cultural, the religious impact. It was huge.
Profound. You have the Augustinian priests playing a massive role in spreading Catholicism.
Which became the state religion and still is the dominant faith for so many today.
And missionaries did contribute in other ways, too. Yeah. Agriculture, architecture, they physically changed the landscape, and they certainly changed how people saw the world.
But our sources are clear, it wasn't all positive. They were part of the colonial machine.
Intrinsically linked to it.
Contributing to oppression sometimes, through taxes, or maybe not making sure people actually understood the Spanish laws being imposed on them.
That definitely happened. But it's also important, as the sources note, that later on, the church sometimes became a voice for social justice.
So it's complicated.
Very. That duality is critical. Catholicism got woven deep into the culture, but its arrival was tied up with colonial power, with injustice. The church later advocating for justice shows how its relationship with Filipinos evolved, responding to the inequalities that, ironically, colonialism often created or worsened.
And unsurprisingly, all this Spanish rule, it met resistance. Lots of it.
Discontent was simmering for a long time. People were unhappy about the power of the friars, the big land, the haciendas, and just general inequality.
Which led to resistance, revolts. Our sources point to big moments like the Cry of Balintawak that followed an 1863 decree, and uprisings like Tapagin, Saguygulir, the Basi Revolt, Pugad Baboy.
All fueled by anger at the friars, their perceived superiority, their abuses.
And over time, you see this resistance change, right? It starts maybe as peaceful petitions asking for reforms.
But eventually shifts towards armed struggle, towards independence. And that's when you see figures like Rizal emerge, using the pen, his writing, to push for change.
And then others like Bonifacio, Aguinaldo.
Taking up the sword, leading the fight more directly. And groups like La Liga Filipina and later the Katipunan, they were crucial for organizing that growing nationalist feeling.
What's really striking is how you can trace the development of a Filipino national consciousness.
Definitely. At first, maybe the focus was just getting a better deal within the Spanish system, but the constant injustices, the lack of real change, it just built momentum for wanting a complete break, self-rule.
And the fact that there were different leaders, different groups with different ideas on how to get there.
Right. It shows it was a complex, evolving movement, not just one single thing.
Then boom, 1898, the Spanish-American War.
Spain was clearly weakening. The U.S. declares war, sinks the Spanish fleet in Manila Bay.
And the First Philippine Republic gets proclaimed. A huge moment.
But then the U.S. doesn't recognize it.
Exactly. Which leads straight into the Philippine-American War. A really fascinating, often kind of glossed over period for both countries.
Yeah, that war was a massive turning point. Spain loses its colonies, sure, but for the Philippines, the arrival of the U.S. as the new colonial power just crushed the hopes of that brand new republic, ushered in a whole new phase of foreign control and conflict.
Right. And the McKinley administration in the U.S., they had this big dilemma, didn't they? What to do with these islands they suddenly controlled.
Exactly. Their Treaty of Paris in 1899 makes it official. Philippines becomes a U.S. territory.
And the U.S. starts setting up its own government system, the Organic Act of 1900. That sets up a Philippine assembly, though Washington kept a tight grip.
And figures like Governor General Taft were key in managing that transition, shaping those early American years.
The stated goal you mentioned was eventual self-government.
That was the line, yes.
Yeah.
But it was definitely tangled up with American strategic goals, economic interests in Asia, so it was a complex, sometimes contradictory way of ruling.
One thing the Americans did really push was education.
A huge focus. They saw it as the tool to prepare Filipinos for self-government.
Which was a massive contrast to the Spanish, who'd mostly neglected mass education.
Right.
And apparently even suppressed some of the native ways of writing.
Yes, the sources are pretty critical of the Spanish for not engaging with or building on the indigenous literacy and culture they found.
So the American focus on schools was different. Though some critics felt it was also kind of denationalizing
Right.
because of English being the language, the curriculum.
It's a fair point. The educational push had a huge lasting effect. More people could read, participate in government, the economy. But yes, using English, the specific curriculum that inevitably shaped cultural identity, built certain kinds of connections.
But even with American rule firmly in place, that desire for independence, it didn't just go away.
Not at all. Those earlier calls for reform, for equality, for the ilustrados, the educated elite had laid a strong groundwork. The dream of self-determination kept going right through the American period.
That nationalist spirit proved pretty persistent.
Absolutely. The struggles against Spain provided the history, the inspiration for continuing that fight against a new colonial master.
Then came World War II, Pearl Harbor, 1941, and suddenly the Philippines is right in the thick of it.
A major front. MacArthur was there, but the Japanese invasion was swift. Manila fell in 42.
And life under Japanese occupation sounds just brutal. Restrictions on everything, food shortages, constant fear.
An incredibly harsh period. But even then, resistance movements popped up. Filipino-American guerrilla units.
And the Huckaballa.
The People's Army against the Japanese.
Oh, yeah.
Fighting back. It's interesting, too, the sources mention that even back during the revolution against Spain, there were some Filipino groups who actually wanted Spain to stay.
Really?
Yeah, it just shows how complex forming a national identity can be. Allegiances weren't always straightforward.
Wow. Okay, so the war ends, Japan is defeated, but the Philippines is devastated.
Huge challenge. Post-war reconstruction. The damage was immense. Rebuilding was a massive undertaking.
They set up a rehabilitation commission.
Which was vital. But dealing with international aid, the politics of the post-war world, it was all very complicated. And economically, it's kind of surprising.
What's that?
Well, despite the devastation right after the war, the Philippines was actually in a relatively strong economic spot compared to some neighbors in Asia.
Huh. But that didn't last.
Unfortunately not. Later struggles led to that label, the sick man of Asia, for a time, though there have been periods of much stronger growth more recently.
What caused the downturn?
Various things. Policy choices, like import substitution, didn't always work out. Debt started piling up in the 70s and 80s. It's a complex economic story. The more recent growth often linked to things like remittances from overseas workers.
Now, a really pivotal and often dark period is martial law under President Marcos, started in 1972.
Right. His justification was rising insurgency, civil unrest.
But the reality was a swift crackdown, suppressing opposition, arrests, media censorship.
And serious human rights violations became a major, deeply troubling feature of that era. Arbitrary arrests, torture, civil liberties just curtailed across the board.
It's such an important period to understand.
Absolutely. The martial law era is a really stark lesson about how fragile democracy can be, how concentrating power can lead to abuses, the erosion of rights. It left deep scars on society and politics.
But that authoritarian period didn't last forever. It ended with the People Power Revolution in 1986.
A truly transformative event. And our sources rightly link it back to those long-term grievances against Spanish rule, later authoritarianism, the groundwork laid by the Ilustrados demanding reform.
And then the specific triggers, right? The assassination of Ninoy Aquino.
That was a huge catalyst. Plus the widespread belief that the elections were fraudulent. It all just boiled over.
And the EDSA revolution itself, those massive nonviolent protests, it's still incredible to think about.
It really is. A powerful example of collective, peaceful action against oppression. It showed the world the strength of nonviolent resistance and inspired democracy movements elsewhere.
So that brings us closer to the present day, the contemporary Philippines,
where we see the legacy of everything we've discussed playing out.
Our sources mention the complex modern political scene, the ongoing drive for economic growth, tackling poverty, attracting investment.
And the culture itself. Vibrant, mixed syncretic is the term often used. Shaped by centuries of contact with different powers. Spain, the U.S., Japan, but still distinctly Filipino.
I like that metaphor used in the sources, the magdaragat, the traditional fishing boat.
Yeah, it's a good one. Enduring in its basic form, its core values, but always adapting to the changing waves, the changing times.
And the relationship with Spain specifically remains unique, doesn't it? Because of that deep shared history, the cultural links.
Definitely. It's a connection unlike any other, really. Shaped by centuries of interaction, colonialism, yes, but also cultural exchange that continues today. You see it in language, religion, family names, food. It's deeply embedded.
Okay, so as we wrap up this deep dive, what are the main takeaways? A few things really stand out to me.
Go for it.
First, just that incredible resilience, that spirit of resistance the Filipino people have shown over centuries against different powers, different forms of control.
Absolutely. Constant theme.
Second, how complex the interaction was between the existing social structures, like that patron-client thing, and what the colonial powers imposed. It wasn't simple replacement.
No, it was adaptation, manipulation, reinforcement, with long-lasting consequences.
And finally, just this ongoing, evolving search for national identity, for sustainable prosperity. It's a continuous journey.
Well put.
We've covered a lot of ground, a really long history, but hopefully this has given you, our listeners, a clear map of those key developments, without feeling completely swamped by information, maybe sparked a few aha moments.
Hopefully so.
So here's a final thought for you to maybe chew on. Given this really unique history, centuries of foreign influence, multiple periods of resistance, different colonial powers, how might all that shape the way the Philippines approaches its global relationships today, its alliances, its place in the world, its ongoing sense of self?
That's a great question. How does history inform the present and future on the world stage?
Exactly. Definitely something worth thinking about. And look, if any particular part of this history grabbed your attention with the Spanish era, the American period, the Revolution, we really encourage you to dig deeper.
There's so much more to explore.
Absolutely, a truly rich and fascinating history.